The Soviet Union liked to present itself as a country where order, law, and justice reigned. But even in a society that lived under the constant eye of the state, dark shadows lurked. In the 1960s, this illusion collapsed. For the first time in the history of the USSR, a serial killer appeared officially, about whom the whole country learned. His name was Vladimir Ionesyan. For some, he was just another criminal. But for millions of Soviet citizens, he became the embodiment of horror, fear, and an invisible threat. Vladimir Ionesyan was born in 1926. His childhood was spent in a difficult time, when the whole country was still recovering from the revolution and civil war. The war left its mark on him: lack of attention, harshness of life, lack of stability. From an early age, he stood out among his peers with a strange combination of charisma and cruelty. He knew how to attract attention, could appear polite, and even a pleasant conversationalist. But behind this was a cold indifference to other people. This combination of charm and inner darkness would become his main weapon. In his youth, Ionesyan did not have bright successes. He often changed jobs, did not stay anywhere for long. His life was chaotic, but at the same time, he was skillful in manipulating people. He learned to wear the mask of a decent person. He could easily gain trust, convinced that he was an authoritative person. This ability became a deadly tool for him. But what made him take a step into the abyss? Psychologists and researchers would later say, he did not have a simple thirst for money or power. He was attracted by the feeling of control over others. He wanted to feel like a god in a world where everyone else was just pawns in his game. Ionesyan took his first steps in Moscow in the late 1950s. He posed as an employee of the prosecutor's office. A black suit, a confident tone, documents that looked convincing, and that was enough for people to believe. He went into apartments, dormitories, even schools. Under the guise of inspections or official business, Ionesyan gained access to potential victims. And then everything depended on his desire. Sometimes he just robbed people, sometimes he left them alive. But gradually his appetites changed. He had little money. He needed power, fear, the lives of others. 1960, Moscow, evening. Vladimir Ionesyan is dressed impeccably. A dark suit, a white shirt, with documents confirming his official position. He knocks on the door of the dormitory, introduces himself as an employee of the prosecutor's office. A young woman opens it for him. It would seem that this is an ordinary check, of which there were enough in the Soviet Union. But this meeting was the beginning of a bloody series. Ionesyan quickly realized that he could penetrate people's lives with impunity, using the authority of the state. At first, he took things, jewelry, money. But very soon, another thirst appeared, a thirst for blood. He was drawn not to the prey, but to the process of killing itself, to the feeling that he was deciding the fate of a person. Psychologists would later say, for Ionesyan, the lives of others were worth nothing. He killed not out of hatred or revenge, but for the sake of inner pleasure. His methods were simple and brutal. He acted cold-bloodedly. He always gained trust, then suddenly attacked. He used a knife, inflicting fatal blows, sometimes strangling his victims. His blows were precise, without hesitation, as if he were doing a regular job. The horror is that Ionesyan did not leave a clear logic in choosing victims. They could be women, children, the elderly. He killed when he felt the need. And it was this unpredictability that made him so terrible for society. In a short period of time, Ionesyan took the lives of several people. His first victims were unsuspecting women. They trusted a man in a formal suit who presented himself as an authority figure. One story is particularly tragic. He entered the apartment of a young woman with a child. At first, he spoke politely, but within minutes he had turned into a monster. He left the child alive, but killed the mother. For many psychologists, this was evidence that he was playing with his power, deciding who would live and who would not. Rumors spread quickly. In Moscow and other cities, stories were circulating about an unknown prosecutor who was going from apartment to apartment and killing people. The Soviet authorities tried to hide the truth so as not to spread panic. But people knew a predator was roaming the dark hallways and dormitories, and his face might seem familiar. He could knock on anyone's door. For the first time in the country's history, Soviet people felt that even under the all-seeing eye of the state, they were defenseless. Law enforcement officers worked at a frantic pace. Special investigative groups were created. But the main difficulty was that Ionesyan was extremely convincing. Many people, even after meeting him, did not immediately understand that they were talking to a murderer. He remained in memory as a confident man in a suit. And yet he began to make mistakes. His excessive self-confidence, thirst for risk, and desire to play with victims became his weak point. In December 1960, the police received new reports. Several witnesses described a man who introduced himself as an employee of the prosecutor's office. They all described him in a similar way, of medium height, neatly dressed, self-confident. The investigators had a major clue. He used the same legend too often, and this was his fatal mistake. On December 27, 1960, the operatives set a trap. In one of the Moscow hostels, Ionesyan again tried to introduce himself as a prosecutor's officer. But this time he was already being watched. He was detained almost without resistance. He was sure that even now he would be able to get away with it. At first he spoke calmly, joking, but when he was presented with evidence, he began to get nervous. And then he broke down. During interrogations, Ionesyan behaved strangely. He seemed to enjoy the attention. He confessed without any particular pangs of conscience. He described his crimes calmly, in detail, as if telling an everyday story. There was no regret or sympathy in his voice. He seemed to be playing with the investigators themselves, getting pleasure from the fact that they were forced to listen to him. Ionesyan's trial was quick. There was no room for long trials in that system. His crimes had become too high profile, and the authorities were eager to set an example as soon as possible. He sat calmly in the courtroom. He didn't shout, he didn't make excuses. His face remained stony. It was even more frightening than any emotions. Prosecutors read out evidence. Witnesses talked about meetings with him. Relatives of the victims cried. But Ionesyan barely reacted. He seemed to be watching a play in which he played the main role. The verdict was clear: the death penalty. Ionesyan heard the sentence absolutely calmly. Not a muscle in his body twitched. He did not beg for mercy, did not try to save his life. He only smiled. This smile was remembered by many present. It was more terrible than the crimes themselves. Before the execution, Ionesyan spent several weeks in his cell. His cellmates recalled that he behaved calmly, even jokingly. He had no fear of death. On the night before his execution, he asked only for a cigarette and tea. No words of remorse were uttered, no last confessions. In 1961, the sentence was carried out. Vladimir Ionesyan, the first officially recognized serial killer of the Soviet Union, ended his life where all such stories ended, in a basement with a bullet in the back of the head. When the bullet caught up with Vladimir Ionesyan, the Soviet authorities breathed a sigh of relief. But in fact, his story did not end there. It left a deep mark on people's memory. Millions of citizens realized for the first time, even in a country that seemed to control everything and everyone, a monster could appear that hunts in the darkness, and it could knock on your door. Ionesyan became the first in Soviet history to be officially recognized as a serial killer. For a long time, the authorities did not want to acknowledge the very fact of the existence of such people. After all, according to Soviet ideology, maniacs and serial killers were the product of the fallen West. But the Ionesyan case destroyed this illusion. It became clear that evil can be born anywhere. And even where the dictatorship of the law reigns, chaos lurks. People remembered the murderous prosecutor for a long time. Mothers forbade their children to open the door to strangers, even if they claimed to be government officials. Fear permeated everyday life. Doors began to be locked in entrances, and guards were set up in dormitories. For the first time, people began to look at the state not as an all-powerful shield, but as something that could also be powerless. Ionesyan's story became a symbol that the most terrible evil always wears a human face. He was not a scary monster on the outside. He had no horns or fangs. He was an ordinary man in a suit who knew how to speak confidently and smile. And that is what made him even more dangerous. His smile in the courtroom still remains in the memories of those who saw it. The smile of a man who considered himself above the lives of others. Vladimir Ionesyan, the first serial killer of the Soviet Union. His life was cut short in 1961. But his story still makes us ask the question, can we really recognize evil when we look it in the eye?